Hi, Alex Williams here, founder of the New Stack. Today was Sridhar, who is the CEO and founder of Kinvey. I've known Sravish a while, and he's a sponsor for us here at the New Stack. So thank you very much for your support, Sravish. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Alex. And I love reading what you write on the New Stack. It's fantastic.
Thank you. Well, in these interviews I've been doing with people like Adrian Cockcroft, and I recently interviewed Sage Weil, who is behind the Ceph storage, and really wanting, talking to people about their background and who they are, and I think it gives a good picture of the context for where people like yourself come from. And so I thought we would just spend some time just talking about you. It's like
Sure.
a good topic. So I'm curious where you grew up, and when did you first starting to get interested in technology?
Well, I grew up in India in a town called Chennai, down in the southern part of the country. And I got my first computer when I was 7 years old. And I used to write code using a cassette tape and store the
Really?
code on a cassette tape. And then started getting better computers and better computers. And every year and a half, it felt like my computers were getting upgraded. But I had my first formal computer science class when I was, I think, 14. I learned BASIC and Pascal.
What was it about when you were 7 years old that you remember about getting that computer, and were your parents encouraging of that education? I guess they were.
Yeah, my mom was a geek. She still is. In fact, I joke around that she has more electronics in the house than even I do. She has one of every phone and tablet and watch and everything that you can think of. And she really was interested in electronics. I remember as a kid in first grade, we had a VCR that wasn't working well. You put the cassette tape into the VCR, and the image was really blurry on the television. I so remember distinctly, 5 years old, sitting down with my mom where we opened up the VCR and we got some cleaning fluid and we got a little earbud, and we meticulously cleaned all the dust away from the inside of the VCR, and she told me what was what and how the VCR worked. And we moved from different types of electronics over to computers, and it was fascinating to play with a toy that would communicate back to you. That was my initial interest in computers. It wasn't a one-sided interaction. It was I could make it do things, and it did it, and that was fascinating. And then I started formally learning how to write code. And then, I think by the time I was about 15 or 16, I was writing tons of code in BASIC and Pascal and C. And that's when I knew that this is the profession that I wanted to pursue.
Wow. So you learned BASIC first?
BASIC was the first language, formal language that I learned. And then, all the cool kids were learning Pascal because apparently it was a lot better. So learned that.
Things don't change. Things don't change, do they?
Yeah, there's go-tos and functions in every language. It's about the same.
Yeah. So you went to university where then?
So I was one of the oddballs where when I was graduating from high school in Chennai, most of my friends, I went to a school that was renowned for its academics in the whole country. Actually, we're one of the top 5 high schools in all of India. And a lot of my classmates ended up going to the 2 of the premier engineering colleges in India, essentially the IITs, and another university called BITS Pilani. And I was the oddball. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I was also a very good golfer, so the part of me that perhaps wanted to be a professional golfer. And then I could act. I did a lot of stage acting. And so there's a part of me that wanted to be an actor. And so I wasn't exactly sure whether I wanted to pursue which profession. And it was a funny story. I met a friend of my dad's who'd studied in the U.S., and he said, what do you like to do? I said, I'm good at computers. I'd love to play golf and maybe act a little bit. And so a week later, he invited me to his house, and he took out the Princeton Review and said, here are the top 25 computer science programs in the country, in the U.S. And he took out another sheet of paper that had the top 25 colleges in the U.S. for women.
For what?
For women, beautiful women.
Okay.
And he created the intersection of that list, and he said, these are the colleges you should apply to. And that's how I ended up at the University of Texas at Austin. It was the #1 in the intersection of computer science and beautiful women. I thought it was a great way to pick a college.
And you loved Austin, didn't you? You loved. I remember having that conversation.
It's an amazing feeling to go somewhere when you're 18 years old and learn how to live on your own. I figured it out. I graduated debt free with no help from anyone. Moved to a foreign country. Wrote computer science programs for companies in Austin. I worked as an intern for multiple companies. Worked as a teaching assistant when I was in college as an undergrad. And the feeling of graduating with a degree, but doing it yourself, was fantastic, and had a hell of a lot of fun doing it. Austin's a great town.
Yeah, yeah. So where did you go after college? Who did you work with? And what was your special? What were you focusing on at that time of your life?
Yeah, so right around my senior year in college, I was helping out with a project called SETI at Home, which was doing distributed computing using people's PCs. It was a screensaver that you would download and put on your PC, and when the screensaver kicked up, it would launch and run some computations that tried to analyze data to determine if there was extraterrestrial intelligence.
Excellent.
It was a really popular project. About 750,000 people downloaded that screensaver. And I met some guys in 2000 that wanted to start a company that took that idea and commercialized it and made it into enterprise software.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a bunch of us that got together, and a company called United Devices was formed based in Austin. And we built grid computing software. The terminology for what we did was called grid computing. If you remember, in the mid-2000s, everybody were talking about grid. Oracle, I think one of their databases was called Oracle 9G. G stood for grid. And it was the precursor to cloud. And I started off writing code. I wrote a piece of software that 3.5 million people downloaded, put it on their PC.
A lot for them.
Yeah, it was, at the time, it was the largest virtual supercomputer in the world.
Wow.
We were doing.
What was it called?
Grid.org was the project.
Okay.
And GridMP was a piece of software. And so I started off writing code and then managed the engineering team. I also became really good with customers and ended up moving to Europe in 2003 to grow our customer base in Europe. And so eventually I became a consultant, a product manager, and a sales guy. And so in a period of about 7 years, I did everything in the company except marketing.
I get a sense you like the road, though. I get a sense that you're the kind of person who likes to get out on the road and meet people and talk to them.
That's totally right. And part of it is, the reason I like to do that, Alex, is because I like to find out what people want. I think too many of us sit down in our own bubbles and talk about products and features, and not enough time is spent with actual users. And what I enjoy the most, and I still do it today at Convey, is I spend at least 2 weeks a month completely on the road, talking to either partners or customers. And I learned that in my journey in United Devices when I joke around that the George Clooney character in the movie Up in the Air, I was that guy for 4 years. Fantastic. I really enjoyed it. And we got acquired, United Devices got acquired in 2007 by a company called Univa, and then I stayed on for a year, and then that's when I paused and said, let me take some time off and figure out what I want to do next. It was a fantastic journey. Living in Europe, traveling the world, talking to customers, essentially creating a category called grid computing, which didn't exist until that point, and building what was considered one of the top two software companies in that space was a really great journey.
It's on the road that you also have the serendipitous occasions where you meet someone or you have a conversation and it changes your perspectives quite a bit, if not just for a short period of time and then influencing kind of your longer thinking. But you must have a lot of those examples.
Absolutely. I mean, case in point, at United Devices, the first 5 years, we were primarily focused on delivering grid computing software for R&D departments.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, we were helping people that were looking for drugs. In the oil and gas industry, we were working with people that were trying to model oil wells. But during my travels, I started meeting folks from telcos, specifically companies like British Telecom and France Telecom and Deutsche Telekom in Europe. And we started talking about data centers and how, just like we were trying to optimize usage of infrastructure for large-scale computing, we started talking about how to optimize infrastructure to run virtual machines on them.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a similar problem. It's just a different use case, but a similar problem. And we created a product called Reliance that essentially took the existing software that we had, but essentially looked at it as a virtual machine provisioning use case.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you optimize running VMs on infrastructure based on the demands of an application? And I joke around that that was sort of Cloud 1.0 from an infrastructure standpoint, but we called it virtual private grid. We weren't smart enough to come up with the name cloud to describe what we were doing. We called it virtual private grid. But in essence, it was the ability for a telco to extend their data center as a virtualized computing asset for their customers.
Mm-hmm.
But that all happened when I was on the road talking to people and just like trying to figure out what they were asking for.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing happens quite often for us here at Kinley as well.
So at that time, did you start thinking about how the resources are used and optimized for how back-end as a services could influence application development? Was that on your mind at the time?
It wasn't from a mobile standpoint. The way that happened was actually very interesting. So after United Devices got acquired, I took a year off, and I traveled around, and I met a young woman who I fell madly in love with. And
where did you meet her?
So I actually met her in India. I was living in London, and I met her in India, and I found myself traveling back and forth between London and Bombay on almost on a every 2-week basis.
Oh my word!
And about 3 months in, she said, "I've got some news." I said, "What's the news?" She said, "I'm moving to Boston to start a PhD at Harvard." I said, "Well, I guess I'm moving to Boston too at some point." And that's how I ended up, instead of going from London to Bombay, started flying from London to Boston every 2 weeks. And at some point I said, okay, this is enough. I think I need to move to Boston for good.
It must have felt like a shorter trip, though.
It was much nicer to fly to Boston than to Bombay, I can tell you. And then, I moved to Boston, and then we got married, and we got settled down in Cambridge. And when I was in Boston, I was visiting a friend's house, and I distinctly remember we were talking about technology, and his wife came into the kitchen from the back garage door, and she had a few bags of groceries. And she came into the kitchen and dropped the groceries down. And their kids ran down to the kitchen from upstairs and started rummaging through the groceries. And then the kids looked at Mom and said, where's my cookie dough? And where's my Post-it notes? And a whole bunch of things that they'd asked for that she didn't have or she didn't buy. And she pointed to a board on the refrigerator and said, well, you guys didn't write what you wanted on the list on the board, and that's why I didn't buy it. And that felt odd to me because all of us had phones, all of us had like version 1 of the iPhone at that point. And I asked the question, I was like, why are you guys still using a board? Why aren't you using your phone? And that's when the light bulb went off for me, where it was a realization, which in hindsight was pretty obvious, but it was a realization that a majority of the applications on the iPhone at the time were client-only applications. They weren't connecting to any back-end services. Notepad or Notes was a pure client-based app. It wasn't syncing with the cloud. And even Angry Birds, which was the popular game back then, was a client-only app. If I bought a new iPhone or if I uninstalled and reinstalled Angry Birds, I had to start from level 0 again because there was no context of previous levels. I wasn't syncing information back to a cloud.
So the version updating was just as much a chore for a mobile app as it was for any other kind of desktop app.
Exactly. And I said, why is that? Why aren't mobile developers syncing or connecting to data stores or backend services or letting me log in? You know, why is the bar this high for the hundreds of thousands of apps that were already in the store by then for apps to connect to services? And that's when I started really getting into what the state of the art was in cloud. And I realized that companies were only offering network storage and compute as a cloud service, but that's not what a mobile developer wanted. A mobile developer wanted access to data, wanted access to identity, engagement capabilities, etc. And I said, that's the service I want to go build. And we coined the term back into the service to describe that concept.
Which year? What year was that?
So that was 2010.
So 2010, AWS was really starting to take off.
Yep.
APIs had moved in more into the mainstream of developer discussions.
Yeah.
And
PaaS was also slowly starting to take off.
What was?
PaaS, platform as a service.
Right, it was about then.
Yeah.
What were you thinking about the market and how fast you had to move at that time? It must have felt like there was that AWS eventually would move into this market. I mean, you're a smart, savvy guy. You must have been thinking about that.
Of course, I was, and funnily enough, so some more background. I didn't know anybody in Boston, right? I moved here for love, and just hanging out at home. And so once I came up with the idea, I started talking to people in the Boston ecosystem, as well as people in my network. That's the one common thing everybody said. Why wouldn't AWS or Google just build this? This doesn't seem like a good idea because I think they can just build it. And in hindsight, it took them 4 years to build it. They do have a service now. But my thesis at the time was that none of the infrastructure as service vendors had the interest or the capabilities to really go deep and offer the kind of service developer wants and solve the last mile problem, give you a full-featured stack for the mobile developer.
Right.
They do a great job giving you building blocks or Lego bricks, but developers still have to put everything together on their own. But our vision was, can you truly connect the world's people, devices, and data and enable what's next? Right? And that's the mantra here at Convey. But to do that effectively, you really have to go deep and create those connections end-to-end for the developer. And I, in my heart, didn't believe they would do it well, and so far, I've been right.
So right now we're in a time when we're starting to see another kind of wave of new thinking about cloud computing. What is that new thinking in your view about cloud computing right now? If you could compare it back to those days when you were talking about virtual grids.
Yeah. I mean, cloud computing all this while has primarily been, people have been thinking about it as a computing use case, right? How do I get access to a unit of computing that comprises of a CPU, storage, and network. I think what we're moving towards now is, and a lot of us called it utility computing back then. We kind of compared the concept of cloud computing to electricity. Turn on a switch and you get access to compute. I think what's changing now is because we live as people, we live in a technology world that spans different devices and form factors. I'm sitting here in front of you talking to you on my laptop, and to my right I have my phone, and to my left I have an iPad. And a lot of us are consuming technology experiences across multiple form factors. And I think where cloud goes to next is really understanding who a user is and how they're trying to consume the information that they want, and provide that information in a very contextual and personal fashion on demand.
Right.
And contextual is not just the when and where, but it's also the how. What piece of information do I need to give you based on how you're trying to access it?
And it's still very immature. For example,
I agree.
Using either Google Hangout or Skype, which I have both on my desktop here, but also on my Nexus 5, when I am, going to do something, interview like this on my on the desktop, I have to make sure the phone's turned off.
Yep.
Right. Or the applications, is not running.
Exactly.
Because there's not enough intelligence in the application, and the syncing really to understand where I am and how I'm using it.
Yep. And so, WWDC, Apple gave a remarkable preview into the kind of the world we might be moving into, where they demoed how you could be on a phone call, and your phone is next to your computer, and your computer detects the phone call and gives you the option to take the call from your PC versus having to go to your phone. Or if you're using an application on your tablet, as you come close to your PC, that application gets migrated, or that experience gets migrated into your Safari browser, and now you can consume that experience on Safari. And we're just scratching the surface of how these user experiences are going to transcend from one user experience environment to another.
It's also a time which you and I kind of know very well, just being in this market, for years, is that what we talk about is always much further ahead than market understands, and
Yep.
And so I think that it seems to me right now that there's now an understanding that mobile devices work entirely different than desktop computers.
I agree.
And that the CPU is different, the memory allocation is different. It has more, it has a whole sensor component to it, that you don't have really with other devices that we've seen before. And so it seems that we're just starting to break the surface of that understanding, and that seems like the opportunity. It's like
I totally agree. In fact, in the last year and a half of talking to essentially the global 2,000 enterprises, what I've learned is most of them have gotten their feet wet in building a set of applications for their business. And most of those apps have been the basic productivity-based applications you would imagine, things like email or contact lists or enabling the sales force with information from a CRM, etc. We're now moving into a world where they're asking the question, what does a fundamentally new business process look like in my enterprise? Assuming that my employees, partners, or customers are on the go. Or what are brand new ways for me to create new revenue channels or cut costs by leveraging a mobile or tablet or iWatch or a connected device? And so I see roadmaps. I have an amazing privilege of seeing product roadmaps in these enterprises where they're looking to build applications that are going to create these business processes and be very creative about it. I think in the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to be amazed by how some of the largest companies in the world are embracing what you just said, which is they've appreciated that mobile is different, and they're asking the question, what can I do by leveraging this difference?
So you obviously have a fascination with back-end systems, and it dates back, to 2007 and probably before that. Essentially, kind of how things work, and you talk about, essentially you grew up in a household where it was people were interested in how things work.
Yeah.
And and today, we're looking at a different way for how things work, and mobile is an example of that. There's also other ways that we're starting to understand how back-end systems work and affect applications and application development. In particular, I think of this whole new debate about containers versus virtualization.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what your take on that is. From your from that historical perspective that you have about back-end services.
Yeah. So it's interesting, right? So in the grid computing world, it was all client-side. So in essence, we were writing containers to take an application and run it on a PC, a laptop, or even a server, and send that application a piece of data and have it number crunch on the data and send us an answer. And so we had a highly distributed system of thousands of machines trying to complete a task. But the way we did it was wrapping these apps into a container and distributing that container to all the tens of thousands of devices. But what I saw then happening is we moved from a client-side model to enable this to a VM-based model to enable it. So the next phase was the virtual machine was our container. But when the virtual machine is your container, you have to do a lot of work at the application layer and very often modify the application to create consistency. And that was the sticking point, because very often these apps were delivered through ISVs and you never had access to the code, and so you could never really modify the app.
Mm-hmm.
But the world we're moving into now is, how do I create a standard where an app, when it's wrapped inside a container, can run on any cloud or any virtual infrastructure with an SLA. And I think it's a really interesting move, because ultimately there are going to be cloud wars. People are going to ask the question, which cloud should I run on? And enterprises would want the flexibility to not be locked into a certain cloud provider. And so it makes sense from an architecture standpoint for enterprises to say, we want our apps to be certified on containers so that we have the flexibility to move across cloud platforms.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So are you adapting your roadmap?
We are. So, one of the things, there's an age-old debate, age-old, it's about 3 years old.
There's aspects to that debate that are
It's PaaS versus BaaS. Platform as a service versus back-end as a service is one a feature of the other, and multiple analysts have had their take on it.
Yeah.
And we are now at a point where some of the popular platform as a service vendors like OpenShift and Cloud Foundry are thinking about mobile services on top of their platform as a service offering. The flip side is companies like Kinvey now have a platform as a service offering with our backend as a service offering. So we provide you the ability to run custom code or run websites on our platform, and we manage it and scale it for you. But that entire architecture for our own business logic engine was something we wrote on our own, but we're now looking to transition it over into a container-based architecture, so that when a client wants to run a piece of custom code or a website, we automatically provision that code into a container like Docker, and our PaaS is essentially a set of containers that we're managing and scaling for them.
Well, that's really interesting. I've had a few conversations about this topic, and I'm actually really looking at orchestration as a big theme for the new stack to cover. Just because I think that that's what gets to the heart of it, right? It's like, how do you move around clusters, and if you're moving clusters around, how is the application, behaving on those clusters in these containers, right? And actually, it's just the application code, really. So what do you have to do? And there's a lot of interesting kind of perspectives on that, and it seems interesting that you talk about the kind of intersection of the back end and of a service market and the platform as a service market. It seems that what we're seeing now is, how do I just kind of get the PaaS ready to work properly, right?
Yep.
And how do I work collaboratively, because that's how we work now. How is Kinvey adapting to that kind of environment?
Yeah, so the advantage we have, to be honest, is we cater to a different segment of the developer community. So by being the company's back end or being a developer's back end, we're essentially catering to the front end developer. And so the advantage we have is the developers we work with are not necessarily writing back-end code. They're not writing application servers, or they're not writing APIs. We are that system for them. And so when they send us a piece of custom code, they really don't care what platform we run it on, what OS we run it on, etc. However, in the PaaS world, when I'm writing a piece of back-end code, I am making some assumptions on, what operating system is that backend going to run on. So, for example, what something like a Docker doesn't do is make it easy to run backend applications that, for example, that were built on Ubuntu, to now run on an underlying PaaS that is built on Red Hat Linux or Enterprise Linux, right? So there's no compatibility across Linux distributions yet. And there's definitely
there needs to be that ecosystem of templates.
That's exactly right, and that's not there yet, right? So we're still in the early stages of being able to be cross-compatible across OS distributions, and then we're obviously very far away from being able to take an application that was written for Linux but run it on a Windows cloud infrastructure or vice versa, right? So that's still a ways off, and so I think what the PaaS platforms that are going to adopt tools like Docker have to think about is, how do they make it easy and cross-compatible for applications written with the assumptions of one operating system distribution work on an environment that could have other operating systems on.
So how does beacon technology fit into your perspective? And there's a different context here when we're talking about Docker, but I've been very interested in your interest in beacon technology, just because it seems like we're talking about backend as a service, and and I really associate with it backend as a service. And for me, beacons just came out of nowhere. So I'm just curious on why.
Yeah, it's a great question, Alex. I mean, it goes back to how I'm glad you asked me about how did all this start, right? How did my interest in computers and everything start? And I'm a thinker. I'm like constantly looking at how things are working and what that might result in. And when I look at the phone, and I started to really understand how the iPhone and then the Android phone fundamentally changed and created new business models, the conclusion I came to was the touchscreen enabled many multi-billion-dollar companies because it gave an end user, a completely different way to interact with applications. And that was genius, right? And it was genius because it was a completely new paradigm. You created innovation, but the ecosystem of hardware vendors worked together and made it a thing. Right? So the Samsungs, the HTCs, and the Apples of the world all standardized around it. The next phase was really getting geolocation on the phone correct, right? And again, all the hardware vendors got together and said, this is a critical feature. We want to get geolocation on the phone right. And that created multiple billion-dollar companies like Waze and Google Maps and Yelp and so on and so forth. And then the third phase was getting the camera right. The end customer really said we needed a top-notch camera on the phone, and that's created multiple billion-dollar companies.
Yeah.
And I find that with Apple and the Android hardware manufacturers really making beacon technology standard in the phone, are essentially going to enable the next wave of applications. But in this case, it's going to help the enterprise. I think when an enterprise can really look at this feature of proximity detection via beacons, they can really ask the question, how do I engage my customer? We all know the classic retail coupon use case. You're in a store, I know where you are, I can send you coupons. There are many variations of that. But now if I go to the healthcare space, right, if I have beacons in my hospital, and then if I have a beacon on my wrist, I can now track the entire life cycle of a patient from the time they walk in and they're given the wristband to the time they walk out. Doctors, when they go up to a hospital bed, can automatically get all the data about that patient pre-populated on a tablet because you're close to a particular bed. In a manufacturing plant, if I'm the person in charge of quality control, if I'm really next to a particular part of the manufacturing process and I see a defect, I open up an app, the app knows where I am in the manufacturing process, and 90% of the metadata about where I am can be auto-populated because of a beacon. You can start thinking about all sorts of use cases on what beacon's going to enable for the enterprise.
Just because it's embedded.
It's embedded and it's automatic. It's part of the hardware. And we're still in the early stages, but it's going to get better very quickly in the next year or two. This is going to be as ubiquitous and as easy as the GPS on your phone. And at that point, the back end becomes the glue that provides the context to the application.
Does it lead to a new rise of embedded technologies?
Absolutely think so. And it's going to create that rise across two channels. One is user-based experiences, such as the doctor in a hospital. But then the other is machine-to-machine experiences. I think what this is going to lead to is also these devices talking to each other and exchanging information between each other because they're all communicating on a Bluetooth channel. And so now you're bringing people and devices and data together, which is essentially the initial mission of the company.
Right. Right, and that just seems like it's inevitable. And
totally is.
What we don't see yet are the scaling of passive applications quite yet. I mean, I think that almost you could think of the iPhone as a piece of software, right?
Yeah.
And it does things for you without even thinking about it,
yeah.
right? You can take a picture just by pressing a button, right?
Yeah.
Then in the background, if you have it set up on Google+, it'll just automatically upload the photo for you.
Yeah.
So the phones are kind of that first generation of passive applications. I looked at my Google Now page yesterday, and it said you walked 6 hours this month and you rode your bike 9 hours. And I never have set that up.
Yeah.
But it knows where I am.
Yeah.
And it knows if I'm like on a particular route, and maybe on my phone I'm looking up the best bike route from one location to another. And so now there's a passive application there that's just kind of monitoring me and my location.
Yeah.
And that seems like that seems to be like the next generation of application development are these passive applications. And Sergey Brin talks about it, about the best apps are the passive ones. And it seems like the beacon technologies give rise to that in some respects.
Yeah, I mean, for example, we have a client called Sunsprite that has built a small little wearable that looks like a tie clip. And you can clip it onto your shirt, clip it onto your bag. and it is detecting the amount of light that you are exposing yourself to on a daily basis, and then passively sends that data via low energy Bluetooth to your phone, and then your phone then sends it all to a back end, and it's tracking your light exposure and then mashing it up with your mental state of mind, because it's using research about how light exposure directly affects how happy or sad you are in a given day. And you living in Portland and being close to Seattle might know a little bit about that as well.
Yeah.
But what we found in apps like this is ultimately it really is a function of the battery on the phone. I think the reason we're not seeing more and more passive applications is the phone's battery, if the app is not written well, can get used up very, very quickly, and then the users get ticked off. And so I think both the Google folks as well as Apple are very, very conscious of this, and there's a lot of R&D going on around, how do I improve battery life for these devices?
It's almost like a symphony. It's like, I mean, everyone has to tune their instruments to so the orchestra can play, play something that people will want to hear,
Yeah.
And I mean, it seems like that almost like with with everyone fiddling with their phones all the time. A lot of the time you're fiddling with your phone just to get it to work right?
Yeah.
But if there was way for all those devices to be optimized simultaneously, kind of in a orchestrated symphonic way, that'd be pretty awesome. It would save a lot of time. I mean,
Alex,
look at all the time wasted restaurants have.
solve this problem.
What?
Sounds like you're going to start a company to go solve this problem.
I'm going to do it for blogging. So I've actually been thinking about my events this whole time while we're talking. I'm like, oh, beacons. I know, they did this thing, in Denver, and so in GlueCon. So anyway, yeah.
We need to get you a beacon app where you could get all the folks attending your event to coordinate with each other and meet them and know who's where in the event.
That's a deal. That's a deal. We actually, I've been making a lot of progress this week and in defining the events. And actually, our first one will be October 1st at Heavy Bit Industries in San Francisco. I don't know if you know that group. Hiroku's co-founder started it. Yeah. And then we're going to do a second one in Seattle.
Yeah.
In later part of October. And then we will do a third in Paris.
Oh, wow.
Around OpenStack. And to me, there's this conversation is really interesting for me because I think there's a lot of perspectives here that relate to, to my work in particular, and the discussions about, containers versus virtualization, the discussions about orchestration, but also then the discussions about the internet service providers and how they're adapting to this whole world. And then on top of that, you do have, deeper orchestration issues that these internet service providers are thinking about, but they're also thinking about that because they're getting all these pressures from these applications by the users who are using all kinds of applications. And so we're just on the verge of it. And it just really does seem like it's a time where everyone is trying to understand these new things, right? And so I think in the wintertime, actually, we're going to do an event called the New Stack Intro. We're going to do it here in Portland. And the whole idea being that really it's new to everyone, right? And there's novice programmers, and they're just learning kind of the basics, but they're kind of starting at a level that's much different, right, than programmers started, a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Right? Yeah. They're just at a different level of abstraction, right? Yeah. But the people who have been in application development for a while and are looking at these new technologies themselves and just figuring out how they're going to use them.
Sure. We need to get you out to the East Coast and do something in Boston, Alex.
Well, I know, because here's the thought. Here's my thought on this. So I want to do 1 to 3 meetups per quarter, and so I want to hit the East Coast in the wintertime. I think it's the most beautiful time of the year there, and so I thought, perfect time to do that.
I think another way to think about this also is, I think the concept of the New Stack Intro is a great mechanism to engage enterprises as well, right? Because I think to your point, it's not only developers that are looking to figure this stuff out, but it's also architects and senior management.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the large enterprises are in the Midwest, in the East Coast, down south, and so we may have to get you back into the areas that you lived in as a younger man.
No, I totally agree, and I'm trying to. And to be honest, I'm trying to figure that out. My feeling is that that when it comes to the enterprise, my most it's about technology, but almost more it's about and the developers think about the technology quite a bit, and then they think about the business, right? But in the enterprise, there's an interest. There's people with deep passion interest in technology, in new technologies, but they've got businesses to run and they've got businesses to grow. And so my feeling is there's a lot of conversations that can be had about the new stack business, because then you do have that crossover with technology, and actually that's the first discussion we're going to have at Heavy Bit, and we need to talk about a new stack business conference next summer, and I'd like to do that. Because what you're saying is so true. Because, for instance, I think this is what I've been thinking about lately is like the CEO and CEO are sitting in their offices, and it's a Friday afternoon, and the CEO has been thinking all week about this bill that they've received from Amazon Web Services, and it's a big one. Right? Maybe it's $1 million, maybe it's a $2 million bill.
Yeah.
So the CEO goes over to the CEO's office and is like, I don't even know how we talk about this, just the two of us, and those I think are the kind of the contextual conversations that I think people are having now, and they're trying to figure out, and they just need to be. I think they need to be illuminated more. I mean, I just don't see I don't see those conversations happening quite yet, but I think we're getting there.
Yep.
But it's great to talk with you. Enough about me and what we're doing. But you've been a great supporter for the new stack, and I always enjoyed talking with you. And I'll never forget our dinner in Boulder 2 years ago, I think. Where we kind of just learned more about each other and what we're doing. And so the Beacon stuff is awesome. And I love your tenacity, and in face of the skeptics out there who see that the big guys moving into your market. So keep it going.
Thanks, Alex. I always say this, right? Would you much rather have the opportunity to build a startup where there are no big boys, where you're the biggest player in the market, or would you want to take on the challenge of building a startup in a market where all the big boys also jump in?
Exactly.
Every time.
That's it exactly. I think you're in line with. You should meet Abhi Kavali. Have you met him?
Uh-uh.
He's a shippable. He's a great guy. They're building a continuous delivery.
Nice.
Technology, and he's out of Seattle. He was talking to me about why they moved from. Why they made the transition from using Amazon as their platform to focusing more on container technologies for delivering their service.
Mm-hmm.
And he basically said that he would have had to wait for Amazon to reduce the price on its instances, right? And he couldn't do that. There's no market there. And so he started talking about moving over to container technology, and they actually were talking about building their own, and finally they settled with Docker. But people were saying to him, "Isn't that kind of risky?"
Yeah.
And he's like, "I'm the CEO of a startup.
I live risk every day.
This is what I'm supposed to do, isn't it?" I thought that was a great reply. So anyway, have a great weekend.
You too.
And we look forward to talking to you real soon.
Same here. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.